Good evening, and welcome once more to Vulture's Rainbow Theatre. I am your host, Damon Vulture, and it is my pleasure to present, once again, a strange, apocalyptic tale by our East Texas friend, Anan Imo. This one, about a celestial vision at the end of the world, is called The Angel Rafael. No, Jesus. Okay. Yeah, we're... Good morning, everybody. My name's Chester Wilkes, and I'm a survivor of the nuclear attack of 2034. Your teacher, Mr. Peabody, has asked me to tell the story of how my wife and me made it out of Texas when so many people died all strung out on the highways or trapped in cities they couldn't leave even if they'd wanted to. I gotta tell you, it's a strange thing to talk about Texas. You know, about a place I lived in and worked in for most of my life. Now a place you can't even cross the border into in a lot of places because it's poisonous with radiation and liable to stay that way for centuries. It's hard for me to imagine it. Those towns and highways and cities and farmlands and all, abandoned and overgrown, all those places where people lived. Of course, so many of those folks is all still there, sitting propped up at tables or laying down on a moldy couch, sprawled across the tattered carpet on the living room floor, or arms stretched out over a steering wheel in a car they meant to drive all the way to safety. But now that car is parked out somewhere on a cracked and weedy highway, and them, nothing but withered husks of bone and beef jerky inside because they couldn't drive out in time or gave up trying. I just get the shakes thinking about it. But my wife June and I did get out, and we was able to do it because of a dream. It was a dream that warned me of what was coming long before it ever happened. Some folks might ask, how come a dream was sent to you and not to everyone else? How do you rate? Fact is, I don't. And I don't think dreams and visions are sent. I think they're another way we have of thinking about things. Dreams and visions don't always make sense to us because we don't understand the picture language they're written in. But it's a language you can learn. It's a language made up out of pictures of things that are important to us, made up of signs and wonders that we can know the meaning of if we just sit down and think about them and try to learn what they tell us. In this dream, which I had way back in 1997, I dreamed I was driving a car with June sitting beside me, and we were on Highway 290 going out northwest away from downtown Houston. It was getting dark, and the air was hot and still, and folks around us was driving like they was crazy. I mean, at first it wasn't so bad, just a lot of congestion and people going too fast whenever they had an opening to blast on ahead. It seemed to me like we was all running away from something, but we didn't know what it was. And then things got ugly. Folks cutting each other off, horns being beeped. I saw a car with 3 young guys in it. They didn't look like guys you'd want to mess with. They were tough, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were armed. I saw a minivan with 2 ladies in the back full of kiddos. They went shooting right past us, tailgating the young guys, and I thought to myself, there's going to be trouble from that. Sure enough, in my dream, that minivan hit the back end of the car full of punks. Just a fender bender, but they both pulled off down an exit and parked on the service road right next to the highway overpass. We was right behind them, getting off the freeway for our own reasons. The women issued out of their front seats to yell at those boys, and, well, it looked like things would get right ugly. June told me to drive on past, and we did, going on just a little further to where we saw folks parked on the side of the road under the overpass bridge, some getting out to watch what was about to happen. I saw that the bridge had high concrete walls holding up the earth under the freeway with 2 doors in them, and we went in one because it was open, because it was too crazy to drive anymore, and because being out in the open with what was about to ensue, we thought there might be shooting and wanted to be out of sight. And God alone knew what other kind of jackpots folks was going to get into out there before it was all over. Inside, we seen that there were hallways with rooms. Like the Texas Department of Transportation had built them a bunch of offices tunneled right under the highway, and some other folks with the same idea as us had come in to set in the halls, to get into shelter away from the growing craziness outside. I'm betting someone had busted the lock on one of those doors so folks could get in. We seen that there was a hallway that went back deep into the hill of earth that supported the highway above our heads, so we went down it and found a room that looked like if you was shrunk down and put inside the guts of a computer. There was gigantic wiring and circuit boards and little lights blinking. And somehow, as I watched the blinking and the flashing of lights in the circuitry, I knew it had to do something or other with communications, with radios and TVs and social media and all. Folks sending messages back and forth. News programs sending out their sensationalized versions of what was going on and what we were running away from and what was about to happen. Communications that were stirring people up and working them up and getting them into the state they was in now. In this dream, June said, "Honey, we can't stay here. We got to get out before things go all the way south." She found a desktop computer and started clicking around on it to see what she could learn from it about our situation. And I took the job of looking for a door, some kind of underground portal that we could slip through and pass out of the city until we emerged in some place safe. Between us, we worked it out, and a secret door opened up and we went through it into a long tunnel. When we come out of that tunnel, we wasn't in Texas no more. Things like that can happen in dreams. We was up in Arkansas, up in the Ouachita Mountains. We came out onto a roadside, and climbing up away from that roadside was an old abandoned mini golf course. And alongside that, an old building with a line of doors and windows that used to be a motor court. One of them old-timey motels folks used to stay in back in the 50s and 60s. The whole place looked old and out of use, with peeling, faded paint and an overgrown gravel parking lot. But then I seen at the top of the rise where the office to this motor court with its big picture windows was in good repair, and there was folks living in it. It had a chimney pipe out of which smoke and the smell of cooking breakfast was coming. I went up to the door with June, and who did I meet but my sister Annie? In this dream, she was living there with her partner, not in the house she was really living in at the time in Hot Springs, Arkansas, down by Lake Hamilton. She took us in, and then I woke up. I thought about that dream a lot, about what happened and what we did. I studied on each image, and I remembered real clear what the land looked like and what the buildings looked like up there in that Ouachita mountain country. In the beginning, I didn't even know that that was the country I was seeing, just that it was somewhere in Arkansas. Now, many years later, New Orleans was hit by Hurricane Katrina. And you might have read that the place was just tore up. I mean, some parts of town practically destroyed by wind and water and flooding. A lot of folks just up and died in that business. And then, not long after that, here come Hurricane Rita, right toward Houston, where we was living at the time. And they told everyone to get out of town quick, to use the evacuation routes that had been laid out for us to follow. Well, the night before we was supposed to get on the road caravan style with my brother-in-law and his family, I made up my mind we weren't going to take the evacuation route. I knew that it would be piled up with cars and that nobody would be going anywhere much on those freeways. So when I saw June on the computer looking up stuff, I remembered how in the dream she'd been doing the same thing. And then we'd had to map out our own secret route to get out of there to safety. This was real life now, and we wouldn't be going to Arkansas, just up the road a few hours to a little town called Rosebud, where there was a house we could stay in for a few days. We mapped out a way to go that avoided all the highways, all the evacuation routes that was recommended, and in the morning we left to get out of town. We were stuck behind traffic for several hours in the city limits, but once we got out in the country, out in Waller County, we left the evacuation route with all of its standstill traffic and lit out on dirt and gravel roads through the cornfields and the stands of post oak and pecan, out through towns we'd never heard of, and sometimes following routes that took us way out of the way, but still got us gradually going toward our destination. We'd mapped all of this out with a book called The Roads of Texas, which showed every kind of road there was in each county, almost to the point of mapping out garden walks to people's front doors. We drove anywhere from 45 miles an hour to 65 with no traffic. It was like my brother-in-law and I were driving a caravan through a world in which everyone had disappeared. And as we zipped like the wind to our safe house in Rosebud, Texas, we listened on the radio to how millions of people were stuck on those highways, those so-called evacuation routes, unable to move. And while they spent the night on the highway without restrooms, places to eat, or any ability to move forward, we arrived at our safe house and went to bed. So now I knew two things. First of all, that dream I'd had back in the 90s wasn't just nonsense. It was useful information. Second, this runaway scrape from Houston because of Rita wasn't the thing we'd need to dream for. I knew that because we hadn't had to get all the way to Arkansas. And Rita fizzled out and hadn't done much damage around where we lived. This was just practice. I realized that the real thing, if it was going to come at all, would come later. And whatever it was, I figured, if it had us running to Arkansas, it was going to be way worse than what happened during Rita. Life moved on. We was raising two girls. I stopped thinking about the dream. Until many years later, a national election came up where I heard people saying things that could have come from nowhere but pure craziness. And there was folks giving speeches and press conferences saying things that was downright delusional, working folks up into a frenzy. And I remembered that computer room in my dream with the blinking lights. about how communications about some real dangers had been mixed with emotional stuff and sensational stuff to create panic and anger and fear. And that's when, one summer, I pulled out maps and got on Google and started plotting a course from Houston to Arkansas. I could see we was headed for the future I had dreaded, even though I didn't know exactly what the future was that my dream was warning me about. Now, for years after the dream, I had tried to figure out what place in Arkansas I had been seeing. But nothing I looked at around Hot Springs or in any pictures of the state looked like what I had seen in the dream. Now, June, she loves Arkansas just like I do, and she came up with this great idea. There was a handful of scenic lodges around the state. Why couldn't we visit one each summer? And so we did. One year we went kayaking out on Lake DeGray. Another time hiking through the woods and down to the waterfalls at Petit Jean. We seen the spectacular view from the lodge atop Mount Magazine. And finally, one year, we made our way to Queen Wilhelmina, just off the Tulamina Highway, which follows the crest of the Ouachita Mountains and then takes you down into Oklahoma. As I looked at the country around there and some of the old places that had once been motels or other businesses but now abandoned, I began to see it. This was the country from my dream. It was somewhere up here that we had gone in the dream, and it was the place in my dream where my sister had ended up living. Now, in the real world, she was still in Hot Springs. I said to myself, Chester, if she ever sells that lake house and moves up here, then you'll know for sure that big and bad doings are coming your way, so be ready. That incident and the craziness I seen in the way people was talking politics, that convinced me to start plotting out a route to get to Arkansas, to get to Queen Wilhelmina, or maybe even to some other town just down the road from it. It was clear to me now that if the dream was showing me a future safe place I should come to, it would be this place. One weekend, I just sat down at our old desktop computer and using that old county road map I had, which was out of date, and Google Maps, I started plotting it street by street, road by road, highway by highway, our escape route to get out of Texas if something big and mean ever came our way and we had to flee. I set rules for myself. No interstates, no recommended escape routes, no place where there was only one road through and no way to get off of it. No bottlenecks. And it was hard. You couldn't head straight north for Arkansas with rules like that. You had to double back in places, go around places that looked like nothing but central hubs to feed people into a huge ant pile of no one going anywhere. And you had to make sure there were little out-of-the-way towns along the route where you could stop for gas, where it was likely you wouldn't end up waiting in line with a bunch of folks trying to escape the state. One of the biggest challenges was how we was to get across the northern border of Texas, which was bounded by the Red River. That meant that to cross over into Oklahoma or Arkansas, you'd have to pass over a bridge. Most of the bridges crossing over were part of highway systems headed north, and I could only imagine thousands of people bottlenecked on those bridges, not able to get over because there'd been an accident or a stalled motor or a red light just off the bridge so that folks would be piled up there waiting to be let through 7 or 8 at a time. And you know some folks don't drive like they mean it. They drive like they're sorry to be doing it, counting to 10 when the light turns green before sneaking out into the intersection, braking at turns and practically parking the car before actually making the damn turn to get into the driveway or parking lot. Then you got your looky-loos and your cell phone folks that can't look up at the road for fear of missing something on Facebook or Instagram. I know, no one uses those anymore. That was back in the day. You got to excuse me, I'm old and out of touch. So I plotted out the route, wrote it down, and hid the file away until the day might come when I would need it. Prayed to Almighty Jesus I never would. A couple of years later, I retired at a time when we were going through a big epidemic, that COVID stuff everybody has to get shots for now. Back then, half the folks wanted to get the shots and the other half didn't. The half that didn't, they thought it was the federal government taking away their liberties if they made everybody get the shot whether they wanted it or not. Now we all get it. I guess that means we've lost our fear of it and what might happen with it. The sickness killed a whole bunch of folks, and people's feelings was all ratcheted up again. They was mad at each other, with folks calling each other names and folks spouting theories about why they themselves was all to the good, but the people they disagreed with was eating babies or selling children as sex toys or stockpiling weapons for race wars or trying to turn our country into a Christian theocracy, depending on which side of the arguments you believed. If you watched the news, some folks would tell you it was all a lie. And it didn't do any good to try to look things up, they said, because rich people and elite people and super educated idiot people and Antifa and fascists was controlling the world with misinformation, and the only one you could really trust was God Almighty. And if you acted now, you can buy his book for $14.95 and subscribe to buy his survival rations and MREs for when you got to bug out and get into the country. And then there was the whole abortion thing, which I won't get into. The point is, folks was excited and agitated, and when election time came, they voted for folks who was just as mad and extreme on both sides of every issue as they were. The politicians that won were the folks that was the maddest. In the middle of all this, my sister texted me and told me she and her partner was moving to some place up in the hills near where the Queen Wilhelmina Lodge was. They'd sold the house. My blood ran cold. Now, I don't know anything about international diplomacy, but I can pretty well guess that if you are a leader and you got elected by pissing people off on behalf of other pissed off people, and then you go and talk like that to world leaders, you're going to borrow yourself a cup of trouble. Things already wasn't good with China, and when President-elect Zach Tyler of Texas told a press conference that he was ready to nuke Beijing on his second day in office, well, to be fair, there wasn't no nuking right away. That would take a couple of years, but we all come back around to it, didn't we? Next thing we knew, we was all hearing it on the news. And I remember some weatherman in Houston putting up a map that charted likely ground zero spots and where the prevailing winds would carry the fallout and radiation from any blasts. As tensions got worse between Beijing and Washington, June suggested we pack a few bags and put together some traveling items we might need if the time really did come to bug out. I bought a big plastic gas can and filled it early on before folks was really paying attention to what was coming. You know, in case we got somewhere where we was about to run out and no gas station. Topped off my gas tank too, every day. I reviewed my maps, even went out and drove some of the more complicated routes to get us out of town by sneaking through subdivisions and residential streets and across school parking lots. When it looked like things might be getting to the point, but not so much that you could actually see people loading up cars to escape, June and I cut and run, headed for Arkansas by way of Oklahoma. Just before we left, I remembered something and went to get my guitar. Pretty useless for survival, but I just wanted it. June read off the directions and I drove, then I read the directions and she drove. Farm to market roads, long cuts, not short ones, on gravel roads and dirt roads, little never heard of highways, We found gas stations where we could get gas because they were way out of the way. Even a couple of places where we found motels or hotels that were doing no business because everybody had flown the coop around there. Finally, early one morning, we came up to the Texas border at a little town called Edsall Hill, where a farm-to-market road had a bridge which crossed over into Oklahoma. There was no one much there either. Sometimes it felt just like back during Rita, like we was the last folks on the planet. Meantime, the evacuation routes were packed and moving very slowly. We had crossed the border into Oklahoma and weren't that far from the Red River when there was a bright flash behind us. I mean bright, like somebody had shot a second sun up into the sky and that sun had exploded. Then there was a kind of wave of sound, a boom which plugged my ears and cracked one of the car windows. I pulled the car off to the side of the road and June and me got out. Our ears were ringing and neither of us could hear much. She stood on one side of the car and me on the other, looking up with squinched eyes toward the south at this column of blaze and cloud and smoke rising up miles into the sky and then spreading out like sizzling pancake batter on a greasy hot skillet. And the heat. We both headed to the front of the car and ducked down under the grill as that wave of heat rolled over us. And then there was this noise like someone had grabbed two halves of the universe and was ripping them apart from each other. The ground shook and the sound was so loud it made my teeth hurt. I grabbed June and pointed at the car. We both got in and I drove like a bat out of hell to get as far away from the waves of heat and God knew what else we couldn't see or feel that might be flowing into us and through us. And in the rearview mirror, we could see a wall of fire way far off, but we could see that it was playing catch-up. We prayed that the river would stop it or at least knock it down to size. And I just kept driving, pedal to the metal. And June kept reading me directions and I kept following them till we come to the turnoff for the Talamina Highway and drove on up into the Ouachitas on our way to the Queen Wilhelmina Lodge. We didn't have no reservations there, but it was a place to go, a target to aim for, and maybe if we was still alive the next day, we could go out from there and look up my sister and her partner. It was getting late in the afternoon as we drove along that lonely stretch of road with its forest on either side of scrubby oaks and pines, red birds darting in and out of the thickets, the afternoon sun's light weirdly beautiful from the way it was shining through misshapen clouds and strange colors in the atmosphere. I kept thinking, if I look at the sky too much, I'm going to see 'em. You know, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, galloping across that sky full of flame and clouds on fire. I'm going to see 'em, and I'm going to scream. And June, she was as pale and still as a bleached skeleton on a dry beach. Even though there was the noise of the car's engine and the whisper of their tires over the asphalt, it felt like complete and total silence. We drove down deep into a hogback between the mountain we'd been on and then up the slope of Rich Mountain, where the Queen Wilhelmina Lodge sat overlooking a wide valley. When we come to the lodge, I asked her, "You want to see if we can get a room here? We got to spend the night somewhere." She shrugged her shoulders and sank back into her terrified thoughts and left me to make the decision alone. I decided we tried to stay. Well, it turned out a bunch of folks had left to get back home, including most of the staff. There was a young man on duty at the front desk, and when I asked about a room, he said, "Sure, here you go a key. I can't promise anybody much will be here in the morning. If we're all gone, the kitchen's open. Just get what you want. And if you still have power, you can cook it yourself. Soon as he handed me the key, he left pulling on his coat because it was January and it was cold outside. And I realized we was getting all this for free. There was electrical power for the time being, so we found us the room, switched on the lights, and then turned on the TV to see what we could find about doings in the big world that day. The national news looked like it was being run by high school journalism students that night. I didn't see anybody I knew, and whoever was working cameras and sound was just about lost at sea. But somehow the folks who'd stuck around had scraped enough news together for us to get the big picture. We'd had a short nuclear exchange with China. We'd lobbed missiles at each other until the damage had caused both of us to lose our nerve. There'd been a bunch of explosions here, and the news folks said they believed the same thing had happened in China. We'd ruined some parts of each other's countries for generations. And now we were sitting back to see just how many teeth we'd lost, how many bones we'd broken. The boy downstairs had been right. By the time we left the room, everyone was gone. We took a moment to try to call our daughters to see if we could get in touch with them, see if they was okay, but there was no connection. We was the only ones there in the Queen Wilhelmina Lodge, and we had the run of the place. We come down to the kitchen and went through the reefers and freezers looking for stuff to cook and fixed ourselves a simple dinner, and we had it sitting at a table by one of the big picture windows, looking out on the peaceful view and the dying light of day. It looked nearly normal except for the sky, and I don't even know how to describe that. We strolled around inside the quiet building for a while after supper, not saying anything, and finally June suggested we might just go back to the room and turn off the lights and see if we weren't exhausted enough to fall asleep. Now I get to the part of the story that most of you ain't gonna believe. But before I tell it, I want to remind you what I said about visions. How I believe they ain't sent to us, but that they are a way we have of thinking through a problem when words and thoughts won't work anymore. If you look at it that way, then maybe you can accept this last part of the story. We slept like stones at the bottom of a creek that night. I mean, neither of us ever woke up, and we just lay there asleep in the quiet all night long. Well, I guess I woke up at some point and seen the full moon shining through one of our windows into the dark room, making the edges of things look silver and casting long white moonbeams across the floor. And that was it. I was out like a light again. Next morning, just before sunrise, I wake up. June is still asleep, so I slip out of bed quiet-like and put on some clothes. It looks like the kind of morning I want to be out in if I can stand the cold. I bundle up and head downstairs, outside and on around to the sloping meadow to one side of the building. And that's where I met an angel. There in the glory of the rising sun of morning, there in that little stretch of meadow at the top of Old Rich Mountain was a tall, thin young man with long hair. He was dressed in some kind of royal robe. When I looked close at the robe, I could see that some words had been embroidered into the folds of it, words I couldn't make out. But when he sees me and looks up, I see eyes looking at me with a force and power that feels kind of like what I'd felt from that nuclear explosion the day before. I mean, I knew I was in the presence of power, and I got a whole new appreciation of the words Holy Ghost when I saw this creature. He was holy all right, but he also scared the living crap out of me, and I mean it. And that's when I saw what the words on his robe actually said. They said, "Behold, I make all things new." And that's when he started talking. "Do not be afraid," he said to me, and it was not a suggestion. He wasn't saying, there now, it's okay, I'm harmless. What he was saying was, knock it off. "Who are you, son?" I asked. "You're the most beautiful thing I ever seen in my life, and the scariest." "I am Rafael, the angel of the East," he said. "And on the last day at the end of time, my brother Gabriel will sound the trumpet, and the spirits of all that lived shall rise from the land and from the sea, and all things will be made new." And am I right in guessing that today's the day? That we're at the end of time? I asked. He laughed. And when he did that, when he laughed, it was laughter so sweet and so innocent and so full of love and so far removed from the world of suffering and death that I was moved to tears. I fell to my knees in the morning light there before this glorious angel, and I bawled like a baby. I mean, it was like a lifetime of poison come pouring out through my eyes, and I could feel myself becoming light, like a dandelion seed hefted up on a morning breeze. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I seen that June had come out and was drawing near me. And when suddenly the morning sky filled with a heavenly host, they said, "Rejoice, out of darkness light has come." And seeing that, I made up my mind that if I was going to keep on living for a while, someday I would come back here and nowhere else to shuffle off this mortal coil and meet my Maker. When June saw what was going on, she fell down to her knees, bowing and scraping like I was. We was just overwhelmed. Then I looked up at the angel and I felt like singing. And he said, "No, Brother Chester, it ain't the end of time. That's a long way off. There's still a whole lot of stuff for folks to do here on earth, and it ain't over yet." Now, you'd think I'd have been disappointed to discover that heaven and the New Jerusalem was still far off and that we'd be stuck here on earth for some more time, but, I felt relieved and really happy, knowing that after all there might be a tomorrow left for us, that we weren't at the end of all things after all. That's when I remembered and noticed again that the angel had something in his hand. I couldn't see it before in the glare of the morning sunrise, and it had been partly hid in the folds of his robes, but then he brought it out in full view. It was a banjo, the most beautiful banjo I had ever seen in my life. I ran to our car, which was parked not far away, and come back in a moment with my guitar. We tuned our strings together, and Gabriel said, "Well, Pop, you ready to play?" I nodded, my heart filled with gladness. And Gabriel taught me this song, which ain't gonna sound right with just me and my old voice singing it. But here we go. I'm going back to old Rich Mountain, where the angels sing on high. I'm going back to old Rich Mountain, gonna be there on the day I die. I'm going back to old Rich Mountain. In the morning I'll be standing there. And when I die, I'll leave that mountain, taking wing to the bright blue air. If you're going to old Rich Mountain, tell my kin and connection there, I'm coming back to old Rich Mountain, to my home so bright and fair. I'm going back to old Rich Mountain, In the morning I'll be standing there, and when I die I'll leave that mountain, taking wing to the bright blue air. At the foot of old Rich Mountain, the black-winged redbird has a song it sings, and I know that some fine morning I'll be riding to heaven on its wings. I'm going back to old Rich Mountain. In the morning I'll be standing there, and when I die I'll leave that mountain, taking wing to the bright blue air, taking wing to the bright blue air. And when we finished the song, we both beamed at each other, that angel and me. And then I was alone with June, there in that little patch of meadow, holding my guitar, looking at the rising sun and knowing that no matter how bad the world had gotten, it was, after all, a new day, and there would be more new days to come. Well, we never come back to Texas. Almost no one ever did. Most of it ain't fit for human habitation just now. And y'all know how hard life was for those of us here in our country who survived the war with China. We was among the very lucky ones. Our girls and their families made it out too. It's been a long, hard road for your grandparents and your parents. And now here you are, in a world that's a little more sane and a little less crazy than the one we lived in. Well, you might be thinking that I was just seeing things, or maybe June and I were both having a vision of some kind that wasn't real. And to that, I'm just going to repeat something I read in a book once, something that was said by a Sioux holy man named Black Elk when he told one of the legends of his people. He said, "Maybe things really didn't happen the way the story said, but if you think about it, you can see that it is true." You have been listening to Vulture's Rainbow Theatre. We thank all our patrons who made the debut of Vulture's Rainbow, your mobile home of dark art, at Traders Village, a stunning success. And if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to look up these 2 ebooks on Amazon.com. And now, this is Damon Vulture wishing you a good night and dark dreams.